not stable together.
Oh, you're right there. Never mind.
Story. My side of the story was, here's our other friend, here, let me give you this. My side of the story was, after school, I had to be down at Pitt with this lady who is a specialist in epilepsy and autism. And she's a big deal, you know, because of, autism speaks and everything. I had opportunity for her to see Matthew. And so, okay, I'm supposed to meet this lady at 3:30. So that she doesn't like communicate with me directly, her assistant does. And so our assistant had the address, and it said mailing address. And then I didn't look below, it had physical address. Mailing address and physical address. So I typed the address into the map question, outside directions. I get to the address. It's not the hall, I park in this garage, I don't know where. I get to the place and they don't even know who this woman is. They say, oh, she's not here. She's in Webster Hall. I said, well, this is Webster Hall. So, oh, this isn't Webster Hall. This is Western Side. So I said, well, where's Webster Hall? I said, oh, it's not that far. It's about 7 blocks. I said, what? So I told the wife, okay, we're running late. We walked, right? We walked. So we walk and walk and walk, and we get, Matt, he's lumbering along, right? Looking. So we finally get to this Webster Hall. We're 1.5 hours late. It's starting to rain. Can't figure out how to get on the elevator. Get on the elevator. Get up to the office. There's an envelope taped to the door. Mr. and Mrs. Wallace. So I opened it up and said, sorry, we tried to get you earlier. We had to cancel your appointment. I thought, all right, okay. I'm not going to get mad. I go downstairs. I'm 7 blocks from my car. It's torrentially raining. I don't have an umbrella. I'm 7 blocks from my car. I can't get there. Everybody get one of those? So it takes me, I tell the wife and Matt, you stay here. I walk in the rain. That jacket I had was soaked. I didn't have an umbrella. Then I had to get out of Oakland. I'm bumper to bumper, the whole way down the parkway. I just got home. I left at 3 o'clock. Just got home at 6:30. So I got this stuff together for 6:30, and I thought, well, all right, I can make it up there in time. So I just ran into Ben and Sarah and Brian in the parking lot. So I made it. Here I am. I'm okay. I'm calm. I'm calm. So here's what I want to do. I want to take a look at this DBQ question in a second. But before we take a look at that DBQ question, the last time that we talked, we were setting the stage for nationalism, right? We were saying, okay, look, we have this time period between 1815 and 1860 that we call the antebellum period. And during this period, at least initially, in the immediate aftermath, after the War of 1812, there is this kind of burgeoning, bubbling sense of nationalism. It might start with Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans, but certainly Henry Clay's American system is a part of that, as is the Monroe Doctrine. We said Clay's American system is sort of economic nationalism. The Monroe Doctrine is diplomatic nationalism. Some of the Marshall Court decisions, like McCulloch versus Maryland, is judicial nationalism. Oh, just for fun, that Marshall decision, McCulloch versus Maryland. What was the issue in that case? What was decided there? We said that was a pretty important case. Certainly Marbury versus Madison was an important case. There were other important cases, but we mentioned McCulloch versus Maryland. Does anybody remember what was at issue there? Anyone besides the instructor, Phillips, do you remember?
The translation of the Constitution?
Well, it was the interpretation of the Constitution, whether it was loose or strict, dealing specifically with what? Yes? The National Bank. Did Congress have the authority to charter a bank? The same question that Madison, or the same question that Jefferson and Hamilton had debated in Washington's first cabinet, comes to the Supreme Court. John Marshall, was he a Republican or a Federalist? Does anyone besides Coulter and myself remember? Coulter, Federalist or Republican? John Marshall. Andrew?
Federalist?
He was a Federalist, right? He was appointed by John Adams in 1801. Did we not say that? He was a part of the Midnight Judges. He was the Supreme Court Chief Justice for 34 years subsequently and dominated the court and kept federalism alive. The idea of a big, powerful national government. The idea of the sanctity of contracts. The idea that the state governments could not intrude into issues of private property. So the notions of federalism, Marshall keeps alive with the Supreme Court. So we talked about these sort of manifestations of nationalism, and I promised you, and I know that you would be mad if I didn't do this, that another kind of aspect of this was the transportation revolution of this time period. And so what else promotes a sense of nationalism? What else promotes a sense of nationalism is that the country is going to be connected, right? Connected not only north and south, which most of the rivers ran at that time, or along the coast, but connected east to west, and connected south to north. And so we said that during this time there was this remarkable revolution in transportation that was largely fueled by steam. You know, Robert Fulton's steam engine is significant to this transportation revolution. You know, we said Fulton's steam engine, once applied to a steamboat, allowed transportation up the river. This was a big deal. But beyond the steam technology, we said in addition to that, you also had canals and railroads and turnpikes, roads that connected east and west. I mean, so you had canals and roads initially, and then eventually railroads that connected the east of the United States to the growing western part of the United States. You know, we talked in particularly when we discussed this about the canal boom, and made mention of one canal in particular, the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was entirely built in the state of New York and by the state of New York. It connected, does anyone besides the instructor and Eric know what two cities were connected ultimately by the Erie Canal? Go ahead, Eric. Darn you, Eric. Yes, that works.
Albany and Buffalo?
Albany and Buffalo is correct. So it connected Buffalo in the west to Albany in the east, and from Albany, the Hudson River was navigable to the sea. So the Erie Canal linked the entire interior, all the access of the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. And the Erie Canal really, really catapults New York City into a center of commerce and trade, as it does Rochester and Buffalo, and the towns along the Erie Canal are going to grow as a result of commerce on it. And the success of the Erie Canal inspired others to try to replicate it. However, we said that most other canals are not ultimately successful. There are issues. There is issues of freezing. There are issues of topography that makes canals less than ideal. They are replaced eventually by railroads. And by the eve of the Civil War, I think there's 35,000 miles of track in the United States, and a lot of that is connecting the east to the west. The real railroad boom is going to go after the Civil War, where we really have a proliferation in track, where we get 200,000 miles in track. And the great transcontinental railroads that occur in that time. But speaking of transcendentalism, and speaking of sort of cultural things, also in the antebellum period, you have the Second Great Awakening and ideas of individuality and other things that we talked about. We'll come back maybe to those. But now, with that kind of established, it does raise this question. How do we go from this sense of nationalism in the immediate aftermath of the War of 1812 to the Civil War, which is really the ultimate manifestation of sectionalism? Now, take a look at this free response, or this DBQ question that I gave. This was not a question that I was familiar with because it's Form B. And Form B is the form of the test that is administered to students who, for extraordinary reasons, and students who can convince the guidance department to do it, take the alternative test. You know, we really haven't had that many students do it. I mean, one time this kid was a baseball player and got hit like right in the eyeball with a pitch or something. His eye was like giant, and they let him take the alternative test, and you know, sometimes well, this is, you know, I mean, it's just different questions. I mean, sometimes I don't know if I would consider this question necessarily easy or not. It's sometimes remarkably different. And I don't even know if they might give the alternative test in some parts of the country. You know, I mean, some parts of the country might get Form B, you know, in some questions. Because they have a lot of trouble with texting, you know, the East Coast to the West Coast. You know, the West Coast is 3 hours behind, and so those kids were ultimately frequently done with the test, and they were texting their friends and relatives on the West Coast and telling them what the topics of the test were. Now that, you know, doesn't give you a whole lot of time to study, but it still was an advantage that people weren't excited about. But nevertheless, in this question it says, in the early 19th centuries, Americans sought to resolve political disputes through compromise. Yet by 1860, this no longer seemed possible. Analyze the reasons for this change. And so, use the documents and your knowledge of the period 1820 to 1860 in constructing your response. So it seems to me this question is sort of suggesting that you analyze the reasons why Americans were unable to finally compromise in 1860. Up until 1860, there had always been a resolution to the sectional conflicts that had divided the country. In 1860, that resolution is no longer possible. You know, the sectionalism, the divisiveness that had been there explodes into a civil war. So I think this question, and maybe you disagree, but it's sort of asking you to analyze why. Why were Americans able to compromise initially, and then eventually, kind of what happened? Now, in order to do that, it gives you a series of documents. It gives you Henry Clay's speech to the Senate in 33. Oh, what compromise would that be relevant to? If we said Henry Clay's speech to the Senate February 23, just looking at the date, and thinking about this question focusing us on sort of these milestone compromises, which of the milestone compromises was this 33 speech relative to? The compromise over what case?
Slavery?
Well, not really slavery in this case. Yes?
Nullification?
Nullification. And nullification was over what issue? Does anybody remember? We'll come back to this. The general issue, yes? South Carolina threatening to secede from the Union and nullifying legislation dealing with tariffs. Perfect. Now, and then you have a year later the anti-slavery document there. And then if you flip the page, you have 36 and slavery again. And then you go to 1850. And certainly what compromise is Daniel Webster's speech to the Senate March 7th, 1860? I mean, we're familiar with that, are we not, Phillips?
Yeah.
What is it?
The compromise of 1850.
Obviously, the Compromise of 1850. And then, the caning of Sumner in 56. What was at issue with the caning of Sumner? What brought that caning about? Do you remember? Anybody? Yes?
Didn't he like insult one of the senators?
Yeah, he insulted one of the senators, but it was over ultimately what broke the Compromise of 1850. You remember? Compromise of 1850, the country would breathe a sigh of relief, yes.
The fugitive slave law he was
Well,
upset about?
I mean, it's actually the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 54. And bleeding Kansas, and that was what Sumner was talking about. Flip the page there, and you get the response to Sumner, and then Lincoln's speech at Alton, Illinois in 58. And Lincoln spoke almost exclusively about the extension of slavery. And then you have the election returns for the election of 60, where you have kind of four candidates splitting the vote. Now, those are the documents that they want you to glean from. And if you turn to this paper right here, and this is the one we're going to work on, This is the outside information. Now note one thing, when you look at the outside information, the first thing the outside information talks about is the Missouri Compromise. Was there any documents, were there any documents in there that were relative in time frame, at least, to the Missouri Compromise? No. So, one of the things the AP would be looking for in this is, do the students know that the first big compromise of the time frame that they gave you was the Missouri Compromise? You don't really have a document to hint you at that, right? So they're kind of expecting you to incorporate that into your essay, which gives you a kind of a golden opportunity for what we call outside information. Yes?
Okay, so it says 1820, 1860. What if you weren't sure of when the Missouri Compromise was, and it was before, say, before 1820, you used it?
I think you can still do it, because when I'm going to start this review, kind of this, I'm going to go back to the Constitution. Because I was reading something last night, in order to kind of trace this, and I just, I want to work off the paper that I just referred you to right here. And I'm just going to go through these compromises with you. And that's going to be our kind of review. And then at the end, if we have time, maybe we'll think about the question a little bit. But I mean, just in terms of review, I mean, it kind of gets at the question that we were talking about. How do we go from this sense of nationalism to eventually the sectional discord that divides the Union? And this essay kind of traces the big milestone kind of, not opportunities, the big milestone kind of turning points where it seemed like the whole thing might come unraveled. It seemed like the whole thing might come unraveled and there may be a civil war in 1820. There was a compromise. It seemed like it might come unraveled in 33. There was a compromise. It seemed like it might come unraveled in 50. There was a compromise. It seemed like it even might come unraveled in 54. Though it wasn't necessarily a compromise there, but things built to the election of 60. And in the election of 60, when Lincoln is elected, there's the credendum amendments, which were an attempt at compromise, failed. Right? So what happened is sort of the question. But I was reading, last night I was down in this little cubbyhole where I have all my stuff, and I was down there and I had these American Heritage magazines. And one of the things on it was, 5 compromises that saved the country. So I thought, well, okay, I'm going to talk about this. I look at them. Well, 3 of them were relative to what, 2 of them were relevant to what we were talking about. But I thought I'd read the first one anyways. They had the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. But the other one that they mentioned, it was Joseph Ellis that wrote this piece, was about the compromise in the Constitution. And he made some points that I think set the stage for the other ones. If you think about the great compromise of the Constitutional Convention, the Great Compromise, it's called, the Great Compromise. What was that compromise over? Right? Do you remember what it was? The Great Compromise of the Constitution. This is the compromise that saves the convention. Does anybody remember what it was over? Go on.
The Senate and how the government was to be run?
Yes. It was over representation in Congress. Should the representation in Congress be by population? Should the delegates in Congress be apportioned by the population of states? Or be basically determined by the people? Or should representation in Congress be by individual states? Now, I never really thought about this until I read this piece. You had really 2 conflicting notions there, right? One is that we are a country of people, a nation, right? That is represented by representatives in a Congress. The other notion is that we are an association of states, right? States that are represented by delegates representing those states that come together in a Congress. And on some level, the Constitutional Convention, according to Ellis, was a battle over this. What's it going to be? Are we going to be a nation, or are we going to be a union of independent states? And the Great Compromise, if you think about it, doesn't resolve that, right? The Senate suggests that we are a union of independent states. that are represented by delegates of those states, that cast ballots representing those states, that are appointed by the state legislatures of those states. And then you have the House of Representatives, in which the delegates to the House of Representatives, the representatives, are elected by the people. Right? We the people, a nation. And so the question as to whether we were a union or a nation, whether we could be kind of divided, because you can't divide the people, right? Or we were independent states that came together, is unresolved in the Constitutional Convention. Now, think about this. What also is unresolved is the issue of slavery. You know, so think about the big two issues that divide the country, that eventually are the reasons for the Civil War. You know, issue number one, does a state have the right to secede? If the country is a union of independent states, it most certainly does have the right to secede. Right? And if it had the right to secede, then the states could leave for whatever reason they wanted to. You know, if they felt the compact was not, you know, being fully implemented in the way that they agreed to. But if the country was a union of the people, it was indivisible. Well, what Ellis pointed out in his piece, and I think is relevant to this, is, look, that issue is not resolved in the Constitutional Convention. Nor is the issue of slavery. Will this be a nation that will be free of slavery? Well, the answer to that question is, we don't know. We know that in the North they opposed slavery. We know that many people in the North thought it was a moral evil. We know that people in the North, disliked it. We know that there was consternation against slavery in the Constitutional Convention. But think about where the Constitution leaves it. The Constitution leaves slavery unmentioned. Right? Nowhere in the Constitution is the word slavery mentioned. Right? But it leaves it to some extent addressed. Because the issue of whether slaves should be counted for the purposes of representation is addressed, although ambiguously, with the 3/5 compromise. The issue of whether slaves had to be returned is addressed. There is a fugitive slave clause. The issue of the slave trade is addressed by saying that, look, government can regulate this trade after a 20-year period. But did Congress have the right to abolish slavery? Could Congress take that action? That's not addressed. So the big two issues that eventually explode in the Civil War are not addressed in the Constitution. Now take them forward. What happens? Well, from the very beginning, you get this issue of whether or not we are a union of independent states or whether or not we are a nation from the very beginning. Look, Jefferson and Madison reiterate this idea in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. In the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Jefferson and Madison say, look, the Constitution is a mere compact among who? The states. Right? And therefore the states have the authority to interpret the nature of the compact. Unresolved issue. The Federalists and John Marshall and others say, oh, no. The Constitution is an agreement among the people. Right? And therefore, the people, through the Supreme Court, interpret the Constitution. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions aren't a milestone kind of controversy, but they raise this issue of the nature of the Union, which is unresolved in the Constitution, which comes back up from time to time. It comes back up, it comes up in the Virginia and Kentucky resolution. Then it resurrects itself, the issue of slavery and the issue of the nature of the Union resurrects itself with the Missouri Compromise. Well, look, what happened? The Missouri Compromise is a result of the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana is added to the Union in 1803. Louisiana quickly enters as a slave state. But remember, Louisiana already had slaves there, right? Under French rule. and under Spanish rule. But when it came to Missouri, the first state to be carved out of that territory, entering the Union, controversy arose. Now, the controversy that arose over Missouri in 1819 involved something called the Talmadge Amendment. Is that on there? Is that on there under the Missouri Compromise? Yeah, the Talmadge Amendment. Related information. The Talmadge Amendment. The Talmadge Amendment was an amendment that was connected to the legislation that would have allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a state. And the Talmadge Amendment said Missouri can enter the Union as a slave state if it wants to, but slaves in that state must be liberated when they turn 25 years old, and no more slaves shall be permitted to enter into that state. So what Talmadge and Northerners voted for, and the House of Representatives, interestingly enough, is the one that passed this, the people, right, passed this, voted for, was to admit Missouri as a state with the understanding that slavery would be gradually abolished there. Now, Southerners took issue with this. They took issue with the fact that Congress even addressed the issue of slavery, that this was brought up. And underlying this is the increasing importance of slavery. You know, when we left slavery in the Constitutional Convention, there were a fair number of people, Southerners included, that thought that slavery was this terrible evil that was burdened on the country by the British, and it was a necessary evil, and we hope that someday it goes away. And Jefferson writes about that. Remember we read that? We read about Jefferson writing about hoping that slavery goes away, and fearing. Remember, Jefferson said, "I tremble for my country when I think God is just, and His justice can't sleep forever." And he's talking about slavery. That same Jefferson was still alive in 1820. He was still alive in 1820, and he opposed the Talmadge Amendment, suggesting that slavery, if it was ever going to be abolished, had to be diffused across the country. If slavery wasn't allowed to spread, then it would be too concentrated in certain areas, and those people would never agree to abolish it. So the only way to eventually abolish slavery is to diffuse it across the country. Moreover, Jefferson continued to argue, as did Southerners, that slavery was exclusively something that was a decision that was made by states, and the national government could not make a decision for a state, even a state that entered the Union. Now, underlying this is kind of, the differences in ideology and differences in economy. The plantation South versus the now industrializing North and the commercializing West, right? That's out there. And political power. Because in the Senate, where you had this notion of individual states being represented, the Senate could veto legislation that hampered slavery by having two representatives from every state. The South wasn't as populated. So right there in 1820, it seemed like the whole thing might come unraveled. Southerners were threatening to secede from the Union over the admission of Missouri or over the Talmadge Amendment being connected to the issue of Missouri entering the Union. And the Talmadge Amendment is never confirmed, again, by the Senate. Now, what breaks that deadlock is the Missouri Compromise, which is interesting. Does anybody remember what fundamentally is part of the Missouri Compromise? The Missouri Compromise has three aspects to it. Does anybody remember one of them? Any aspect of the Missouri Compromise? Go ahead.
Doesn't it keep the power of the slave states and the free states even in the Senate?
By doing what?
Adding Maine and adding Missouri.
Right. Maine enters as a free state. Missouri enters as an unfettered slave state. So Missouri enters as an unfettered slave state. So there is no restriction on Missouri's entrance into the Union. It is an unfettered slave state. The Talmadge Amendment does not apply. But, and Southerners voted for this, north of the 3630 line, there would be no slavery. Slavery would be prohibited from spreading north of the 3630 line. So I guess you could ask this question relative to the question that was asked there. Why were they able to compromise then? Maybe it was because that it maintained parity. Maybe it was because as long as the South felt that it had some way to veto or stop the rapidly growing North and West from passing legislation or doing things to threaten their interest, primarily slavery, a compromise was possible. I don't know. We have to kind of think about it, I suppose. Now, after the Missouri Compromise, which, remember, Jefferson described as a fire bell in the night, right? It awakened me and filled me with terror. And remember, John Adams said, I trust this is the first page in a great and tragic volume. Right? So people were afraid that this issue would divide the Union. Now, where do we go to next? Next we go to the nullification compromise. So what happens there? Well, the nullification compromise has a lot to do with Jackson. Jackson is elected to the presidency in 1828, and once elected to the presidency, Jackson is a bit of an enigma. Jackson is a committed nationalist. He supports the national government and is the president of the national government and is committed to a strong presidency, but is also committed to states' rights. In particular, Jackson is committed to states' rights of slavery. Jackson himself is a slaveholder. Jackson is a Southerner, a Tennessean. Jackson has a big plantation with numerous slaves on it, heritage. Jackson is relatively wealthy as a result of slavery. So slaveholders might have felt that their slaves were safe with a powerful Democratic Party led by Andrew Jackson in control. But what they detested were tariffs. Right? The tariff of abominations was 1828. Subsequent tariff revision in 1832 generated great consternation. And in response to the tariff of 1828, John C. Calhoun, who at the time was the seated vice president in the country, wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Is that in there? Yeah, how about that? The South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And what the South Carolina Exposition and Protest does is it extends the notion of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Calhoun confirms that the Constitution is a mere compact among the states, and the states therefore have the authority to interpret the Constitution. And they have the authority to nullify laws that they think are inconsistent with the Constitution. Well, think about it. Here we go. Here goes this unresolved issue. What is the country? Is it a union of independent states, or is it a nation of people? And Calhoun is saying, look, the United States is a union of independent states, and those states can determine the nature of the Constitution. If they think a law is dangerous to their safety and security and inconsistent with the Constitution, they can declare that law null and void within the confines of their state. Look, South Carolina in 1832 has an election. After that election, they appoint delegates to a nullification convention. Those delegates get together and nullify the Tariff of Abomination and the Tariff Reform Bill of 1832 within the state of South Carolina. And they refuse to allow federal officials to collect those tariffs and duties in their ports. And they suggest that the national government uses any force in order to enforce that tariff legislation. They would meet that force with force and secede from the Union. So we said this is a significant milestone. Right? I mean, here we go. South Carolina actually does it. They actually act on this notion that the United States is a compact of states. Jefferson and Madison had brought it up. Calhoun had laid a framework for this notion and given a system, but South Carolina actually does it. Now, before there is violence in South Carolina, Before, even though Jackson raises troops and Jackson, threatens to send troops and troops are mobilizing to come to South Carolina, before there is violence, Clay, and you see that as the first document, proposes a tariff reform bill, right, that would reduce tariffs, something that the South Carolinians wanted. At the same time, Jackson asked Congress for the authority to use force to enforce the tariffs, right, the force bill. Remember what the South Carolinians did? They accepted the tariff reform and nullified the force bill. Now, a compromise, the nullification compromise, orchestrated again by Henry Clay. Clay was instrumental in the compromise of 1820 as well, the Missouri Compromise. And now back again is Clay in the compromise of 1833. Why were they able to compromise? Well, I don't know. Are the compromises because one side capitulates? Did the North capitulate in reducing tariffs? And is that why they were able to avoid war there? Did the North back down? Remember we had that discussion, or tried to have that discussion? Who won? Jackson or South Carolina, or maybe even the Union. Now, after the nullification crisis, for a while it's unfolded, Garrison publishes the first issue of the Liberator. When is the Liberator? Is it 32? Is it January 1st, 32 or 33? It's not going to be on there. I guess if I don't know, you won't know, right? Because after all, I am the teacher. I think it is January 1st, 33. Why is Garrison's Liberator so important? You really should know that, yes. Probably should know the date. I know what you're thinking. You should know it too, by the way. I know what you're saying. You should know it too, you old gray hair. You should know the date. You're the teacher. I know it's January 1. It's either 32 or 33. But go ahead, Andrew. Why is it so darn important?
Because slavery?
The Liberator is certainly a publication that is in opposition to slavery, but it's more important than that.
He said that slavery should be eradicated without compensation, and it should be done immediately.
Yeah, which is interesting too. If you go back, go ahead.
Who wrote that?
William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was the editor, the publisher of the Liberator. And Garrison publishes the first copy, I desperately want to say January 1, 1833. Maybe the 30, what is it, 31? Oh, thank you. You have it in your notations. Thank you, 31. So it's 1831. January 1st, 1831. Maybe I told you that wrong in class. 33 is in 31. But it begins what we call the radical abolition movement, where the opponents of slavery, the detractors of slavery, are saying, look, slavery is more than just a necessary evil. Slavery is a moral evil that cannot be tolerated. It has to be extricated from the country. It has to be cut out. Slaveholders are sinners. It's wrong. Slaveholders should not be compensated for their sin. They should abolish slavery immediately without compensation. Up until this point, most of the opponents of slavery felt that slavery should be abolished gradually, and slaveholders should be compensated. Now, what Garrison is 31 now that I think about it. What Garrison and others suggested is that slavery should be immediately abolished without compensation. And this is a big deal. And from the Liberator spawns other abolitionist groups that rise up in the North and attack slavery. Now, what transpires with that? Does that change things? If we go back to this question, we have a lot of time to think about it, but does the radical abolition movement change, the nature of the controversy there, over slavery? Was it possible to compromise as long as the morality of slavery wasn't at issue? As long as slavery wasn't a moral issue, and it's less a moral issue in the Missouri Compromise. It's not an issue at all on the nullification compromise, at least directly. But when it emerges as a moral issue, right, is that when compromise is kind of no longer able to occur? You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you would respond to this question. But we know this, that the radical abolition movement spread its message across the North and attempted to spread its message into the South. And the radical abolition movement also attempted to bring its message forward on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. There were petitions from abolitionists to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. Although it was kind of accepted by everybody that Congress didn't have the authority to abolish slavery where it already existed, not too many people argued that that was true, but they did have the authority unquestionably to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. And petitions flowed into Congress in order to do that. Do you remember, oh, I don't really talk about this in class, we'll talk about it now, what Congress decides to do with Jackson's approval and under Democratic leadership is to take any petition that dealt with slavery and to immediately table it. So anything that came before Congress that dealt with the institution of slavery would be immediately tabled. Anything on the table cannot be discussed. Right? So they called that, this is in 1836, the gag. Some of you wrote about this when you wrote essays, the Jackson essay. You wrote about the gag. The gag rule being this congressional deal that is made to keep slavery. And it's almost like once Garrison and the Liberator, brings the issue of slavery to kind of a moral head, the gag rule was an attempt to kind of put the genie back into the bottle. Now, the gag rule is going to be in place until 1844. 1844, for 8 years. John Quincy Adams, who had been the President of the United States, and after sort of being voted out of office in 1828, represented Massachusetts in Congress until his death, tirelessly battled against the gag. So John Quincy Adams tirelessly battled against the gag rule as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, the next compromise is the Compromise of 1850. And certainly, the context of that compromise was the Mexican War. Remember, the Mexican War begins under a cloud of suspicion. Who is the president during the Mexican War? Does anyone besides Anna and myself remember? Go ahead, Anna. I'll call on Mandela if I have to. I'm happy to do it. Mandela? You do not, you actually just don't remember this, who the president was during the Mexican War. But you actually don't remember this. Darn you kids. Yes.
Was it Tyler?
No, I'm in pain. I'm in physical pain, yes. No, I'm right now, it would be less painful to have my arm chopped off with a butter knife. Right now, if you chop this arm off with a butter knife, it would be less painful. Yeah. The Mexican War. Yes. No. Polk, my friend. Polk. James K. Polk, right? Elected in 44. And remember, I think your textbook called him the purposeful Polk. What he went for, he fetched. Polk, Young Hickory, the Democrat. Who did Polk defeat in 44 for the president? She always should get this right. No, that's the other. Yeah, who did Polk defeat? Who's the other loser? Clay. He defeated Clay in 44 for the presidency. Clay thought he had it. He thought he hadn't made it. He was going to be elected. He straddled the issue of expansionism. Should the United States expand into Texas? Remember, by the time Polk runs for office, Texas was an independent country. It had revolted from Mexico and had declared itself independent, and it was recognized by the British and the French. And so the question was, should we annex Texas, who wanted to be annexed into the Union? And should we take all of Oregon, 54-40 or fight? Clay hedged on that. Polk enthusiastically supported it, and Polk was elected to the presidency. Remember we said when Polk was elected, the issue of Oregon was settled with a compromise, actually. The issue of Texas was settled before he even got into the Union, or before he was even inaugurated, because Texas was annexed into the Union prior to his inauguration in March. And so the question then becomes, what generates this problem with Mexico? Why do we go to war? Well, if you don't remember who the president was, you certainly won't remember what really brings the issue to. Look at him, he's coming out of nowhere. The man's coming out of nowhere, yes.
Didn't they move troops across the river?
Yes, they moved troops, but that was in response to Polk's attempt to buy. You remember? The Mexicans rejected our envoy. Polk wanted to purchase California. In response to that rejection, we moved troops to the north shore of the Rio Grande, right? Oh, no, not the Rio Grande, of the Nueces, to the north shore of the we moved to the north shore of the Rio Grande. And then they crossed the Rio Grande and attacked our troops. And the result was that he asked Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico. Why? Why did we fight against Mexico? Now, I mean, there was enthusiastic support for the war, at least initially, because the idea was that we had been attacked. That our territory, which, remember, we said was under dispute. Remember, the Mexicans never recognized Texas as being part of the United States, but even if they did, the area between the Rio Grande and Nueces was an area under dispute. And so in disputed territory, there is this clash, and Polk asked for a declaration of war. It doesn't take long for the opponents of slavery to say, this is clearly an attempt to annex more slave territory into the country. And this becomes apparent in August of '46, when a New York Democrat by the name of David Wilmot proposes the Wilmot Proviso to a funding bill that was passing through Congress to fund the Mexican War. And that proviso suggested that, look, the war would be funded as long as everyone agreed that no territory acquired as a result of the war would allow slavery. The Wilmot Proviso was passed through the House of Representatives several times, failing again in the Senate, right? In the Senate that represented individual states rather than the people. Right? Which is interesting. You know, the popular House voted the Wilmot Proviso in, but the popular House, you know, represented people also in different sections. And almost no Southerners, whether they were Whig or Democrat, voted for the Wilmot Proviso. And no Northerners voted against it. And remember we said, look, this issue of slavery now is kind of dividing the country into North and South. You know, whether or not slavery should be permitted to spread. And that issue, we talked about. We said, look, you know, what should be the national government's role in the spread of slavery? Southerners said it basically shouldn't have it. Any territory that is acquired and part of the United States should be free and open to slavery. Anything less than that would violate the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, taking people's property away without the due process of law. Northerners contended that Congress had and could regulate slavery in the territories, and that they should regulate slavery in the territories. Slavery was in fact a moral evil. Slavery in fact strengthened one section of the country at the expense of other sections of the country, and should not be permitted to spread. So now we have this constitutional issue. You know, did Congress have the authority to prevent the spread of slavery? It seems to me, whether Congress had the authority or not to do it, when it became clear that the South had no way to prevent it within the confines of the Constitution, they seceded. I mean, if you think about it, through all of this controversy, the South has the Senate. And in the Senate, they are able to prevent any legislation that might harm that institution. Moreover, the South had the presidency. Whether it was Pierce, or whether it was Buchanan, or some other Democrat, that Democratic Party being dominated by Southerners, kind of had a veto power over any attempts to regulate slavery. When it becomes clear that they no longer had the presidency, and that they would no longer be able to maintain the Senate, and they had already lost the House of Representatives, and inevitably would lose the Supreme Court after the election of 1860, now they secede. Again, I don't know what this says about this question, but back to this, the compromise. The Mexican War ends with the issue of slavery unresolved, a huge territory, the Mexican cession. And whether or not slaves would be permitted to go into that territory, or whether the territory, the areas in that territory would enter the Union as slave states, comes to an issue quickly after the California Gold Rush. And remember, California's population soared, and they wanted admission to the Union as a state. And the then president, who was elected in 48, a Southerner no less, said, make up your mind. What do you want to do about slavery? They chose not to have slavery and sought admission as a free state. Now, this is really a crisis. This is really a crisis. Because now the South is saying, absolutely not. We fought this war. This territory coming in as free will relegate us to a minority status. We cannot accept this. Our position, our interest, a peculiar institution must be protected. And so they called the National Convention under 50. They called the National Convention. That's the first time that thing is stopped. In 6 months. Right? It was in 6 months since the first time it started. I bet you the end of the world is coming. It was nice and out. Right? And good luck to you in eternity. Right? We'll be like Lost. We'll be on the plane. Right? You didn't watch Lost. What's that? No, it's deep. Yes, it was deep. So anyways, okay, we just very quickly, I'll wrap this up in another 2 minutes. What were we saying?
National Convention.
Oh, the National Convention. They called the National Convention, where they kind of intimated that they might secede from the Union. That potential secession is avoided by Henry Clay's Compromise of 1850, which was this carefully crafted compromise that weighed the interest of both the North and the South, and then proposed, sort of appealed to the country to accept it to save the Union. Remember, we said, when given the choice of accepting this compromise or saving the Union, almost all the representatives in Congress chose to reject the compromise. That ultimately the Compromise of 1850 only passes because it is divided into parts and shepherded through the Senate and through the House of Representatives in individual pieces. So the Compromise of 1850 passes, but remember we argued, I'm not sure that anybody really compromised. So again, that raises the issue. Is the reason that compromise kind of was successful is because no one really compromised, in 1820? There was nothing really sacrificed. No one's interests were able to be balanced. I'm not sure. But the Compromise of 1850, if you remember, provided for California entering the Union as a free state. Huge. But the trade-off is the South got a strict refusal of slave law, which was, kind of, I don't want to say moral, but important to the Southerners, in terms of honor and in terms of sort of trust, to keep, that their interest would be preserved. So maybe that's the issue there. Maybe what's at issue here is, can the South be confident that their interests are going to be safe within the Union? And as long as any kind of compromise assured that, whether it's the compromise of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, right, where they had a parity in the Senate, the nullification compromise where they eventually got what they wanted, the gag rule where they silenced the opposition, or even kind of a test with the Compromise of 1850 to see if Northerners would genuinely protect their interests, which, if you remember, they don't believe that they do. They resent Northerners' personal liberty laws. They resent the fact that Northerners balk at sort of enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. And they really resent John Brown's raid in '59. And the support that the Northerners did for John Brown's raid. Isn't that the kind of tipping point? Where they say, look, if you guys can support John Brown, who tried to spark a slave rebellion in the South, how can our interests be safe? If somebody whose name was not even on the ballot is elected to the presidency in '60, and we are destined to lose power in the Senate, the Supreme Court already lost the House of Representatives, and we can't be sure that you will protect our interests without some sort of veto power, do we have any interest in staying in the Union? So that's a kind of a complicated question. I don't know. And I don't know if you found this any kind of beneficial. I think there's going to be something on the test about, the Civil War. There has to be. Maybe the next time we'll talk about that whole notion of emancipation. Look at that. The Emancipation Proclamation. Remember we did Lincoln's role in that? I shouldn't say if you remember what we do, because no one even remembers that Polk was the president during the Mexican War. This is a bad, bad sign, right? Well, all right. Thank you for your attention and attendance. So that wasn't bad. It was about an hour.